It all started with a bridge. Not a grand, steel structure spanning miles, but a simple wooden one I'd built myself over the narrowest part of the lake behind my house. To me, it wasn't just a bridge, it was a piece of peace. Every evening, I'd walk across it with a cup of coffee, watching the sun melt into the water, the surface turning gold before dusk swallowed it whole. I built it with my own hands, plank by plank, during a summer when I needed something to pour my energy into after losing my job. It became a quiet sanctuary, a link between my backyard and the small patch of land across the water where I'd plant wildflowers and sit in the evenings. But to the HOA, it was an unapproved structure. The Homeowners Association in my lakeside community had always been a thorn in everyone's side, but I'd managed to avoid conflict for years. I paid my dues, kept my lawn trimmed, didn't throw loud parties. Basically, I stayed invisible. But when I built that bridge, suddenly I wasn't just another resident anymore. I was a problem. It started with a letter taped to my door. Notice of violation, it read in bold letters. The tone was formal and cold, like a slap written in legal language. The letter said my bridge violated HOA Code 3.2.6, no permanent or semi-permanent structure may be erected on or over community waterways without prior written approval. I remember standing there on my porch, reading that line over and over, trying to process how something on my property could somehow be considered community. I owned the land on both sides of that narrow stretch of water. The bridge wasn't blocking anything, wasn't an eyesore, and definitely wasn't hurting anyone. I called the HOA office the next morning, expecting a simple misunderstanding. The woman who answered was polite but robotic, the kind of polite that comes with years of being indifferent. I explained the situation, how the lake was half on my property, how I wasn't blocking access, how I'd built the bridge safely and even reinforced it with steel brackets. She didn't seem to care. "You'll need to submit an application for approval," she said flatly. "Until then, you're in violation." So I played along. I filled out the paperwork, attached photos, measurements, even a drawing of the structure. Weeks went by without an answer. Then one morning, I received another letter. "Your application has been denied. Please remove the structure within 10 business days to avoid fines." No explanation. No reasoning. Just a curt denial and a threat of financial punishment. At that point, I decided to push back. I attended the next HOA board meeting, something I'd never done before. The meeting room was small, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, a table full of self-important people who probably hadn't built a thing in their lives. I calmly explained that the bridge was on private land and didn't violate any real regulation. The HOA president, a man named Greg with a smug smile and a cheap suit that screamed authority complex, leaned back in his chair and said, "Sir, the lake is considered shared visual property. Any structure altering that view requires approval." "Shared visual property," I repeated, incredulous. "You mean the view of the lake gives you authority over what's on it?" He smiled again, the kind of smile that made me want to put a hole through drywall. "Exactly," he said. The rest of the board members nodded like wind-up toys. It was clear they'd already made up their minds. They didn't see me as a neighbor, they saw me as someone stepping out of line, and they were going to make an example out of me. The fines started rolling in next. $50 a day for non-compliance. I ignored them. I figured I could fight it legally, maybe appeal, maybe just wait them out. Then, one Tuesday morning, I came home from running errands and saw tire tracks through my yard. I followed them down to the lake and froze. My bridge was gone. The planks were shattered, some floating near the shore, others half buried in the mud. The steel brackets were twisted and bent. There were footprints, heavy machinery marks, and a large, orange HOA enforcement sign staked in the ground where the bridge used to start. My stomach dropped. I remember standing there for a long time, staring at the empty space where my work had been. The quiet of the lake felt heavier than usual, like even the water was holding its breath. I called the HOA immediately, my voice shaking with anger. Greg answered, sounding almost cheerful. Yes, we had it removed this morning. It was a safety concern, he said. A safety concern? You destroyed private property? I yelled. He didn't even flinch. You were given multiple notices. It was a non-approved structure in violation of community code. You can appeal the fine if you'd like, but the removal was necessary. Necessary. That word burned in my head for days. I couldn't sleep that night, or the night after. I spent months building that bridge carefully, lovingly, and they tore it down like it was trash. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those shattered planks floating in the water. I started talking to a few neighbors about it, and I learned I wasn't the only one they targeted. One woman had been fined for painting her fence a slightly different shade of brown. Another man got written up because his boat was visible from the road. It wasn't about rules, it was about control. The HOA board treated the community like their personal kingdom, and everyone else were just subjects paying tribute. A week later, I walked down to the lake again. The air was still, the water calm. But as I looked at the reflection of the empty space where my bridge used to be, something inside me hardened. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was determined. I realized that the HOA thought they had all the power because they controlled the community property. But I also knew something they didn't. The lake wasn't natural, it was man-made. And somewhere deep in the records of the property deeds, I remembered reading about the small, old dam that fed it. The HOA might have thought they owned the view, but I owned the land where the dam sat. And if they could destroy something I built without a second thought, then maybe it was time they learned what it felt like to lose something they valued, too. That was the night the idea took root, the one that would eventually drain their precious resort and make them wish they'd left me and my bridge alone. The night I discovered the dam was one of those late summer evenings where the air feels heavy, thick with the kind of quiet that only comes after you've made up your mind about something. I'd been sitting by the water, staring at the broken remains of my bridge, when I remembered the old property map I'd seen years ago while signing the deed to my house. There had been a small marking at the far edge of the land, something labeled Water Regulation Access. Back then, I hadn't thought much of it. But now, after what the HOA had done, it felt like fate had been waiting for me to notice it all along. I went back inside, pulled out the dusty folder that had been tucked away in my filing cabinet, and unfolded the survey map. There it was again, clear as day, a small dam, built decades ago before the resort or the HOA even existed, sitting entirely on the portion of the property line that belonged to me. The notation read Private Control Access Owner Maintenance. I stared at those words for a long time. It wasn't just a curiosity anymore, it was power. The next morning, I hiked out toward the edge of the property where the map indicated the dam should be. It took me nearly half an hour to get there, following the overgrown path through the trees and brambles. When I finally reached it, I couldn't believe it had been there all along. The structure was old stone and concrete, reinforced with rusted metal gates, but solid. The small spillway channeled water into the stream that fed the lake. There was even a locked steel panel box bolted to the side, probably where the old control mechanism was housed. It had clearly been neglected for years, maybe decades, hidden behind thick vines and brush. I stood there, running my hand along the cool, mossy surface, feeling a strange sense of ownership settle over me. This wasn't some random piece of community equipment, it was mine. It had been part of the original land purchase, and according to the paperwork, the Hoa had no legal claim to it. I spent the rest of the day researching. I went online, found old engineering records, and even looked up the original land filings from the county's database. What I learned made my heart race. The entire lake, every shimmering, postcard perfect inch of it, was fed and maintained by the flow from that dam. Without it, the lake would slowly drain back into the river basin it had once been a part of. The Hoa had built their fancy walking trails, community docks, and even the resort hotel on land that only existed because of that water. If I closed the main gate or diverted the flow, the water level would drop within days. It was like holding the pulse of the entire community in my hands. At first, I told myself I wasn't really going to do anything. I just wanted to understand how things worked. I just wanted to know how much control I had. But that was a lie. I told myself to stay calm, to feel like I was still a reasonable person. Because deep down, the thought of watching that smug Hoa president realize what he'd done, it started to feel less like fantasy and more like justice. A few nights later, I went back with tools. I cut through the rusted lock on the control box and carefully pried it open. Inside was a simple crank system connected to a series of metal valves. It looked ancient but functional. I turned one slightly, just enough to hear the faint groan of metal shifting inside the dam. Water began to trickle differently, the current changing pitch as it flowed through the gates. I quickly turned it back, heart pounding, realizing the sheer power I held in that small motion. That one little adjustment could change the entire lake's behavior. For the next week, I couldn't think about anything else. I'd walk by the lake and see the resort lights shimmering off the water, the guests lounging by the shore, the Hoa board members holding their little parties on the community deck like they owned the world. They had destroyed my bridge because it interfered with their view, but every inch of that view existed because my dam fed their lake. The irony made me laugh every time I thought about it. They wanted control so badly, rules, regulations, approvals, but the real control, the literal source of their beauty and property value, sat quietly behind an old metal gate that belonged to me. One afternoon, while walking past the resort's edge, I overheard Greg bragging to a group of residents about the new beautification project they were planning: more pathways, new lighting, and an expansion of the private dock area. I could barely keep my temper in check. He spoke about it like he was some kind of visionary, completely oblivious to the fact that everything he was building sat on borrowed water. That was the moment something in me shifted completely. I wasn't going to just imagine what would happen if the lake disappeared. I was going to make it happen. That night, I returned to the dam with a flashlight. The woods were silent except for the hum of crickets and the occasional splash of a fish below. I could see the moonlight glinting off the lake in the distance. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the crank handle. I didn't rush. I turned it slowly, listening to the deep, grinding sound of metal scraping against stone. The water flow began to change again, stronger this time. The main valve creaked open wider, and I could hear the steady roar of the outflow increasing. The stream below the dam began to swell, carrying water away faster than it was being replenished. I stood there for a long time, just listening. By the next morning, the difference was barely noticeable, just a slightly lower shoreline near the reeds. But I knew what was coming. The lake wasn't massive, it was shallow and spread wide. A few inches each day would add up fast. I checked again that evening and saw the water line had already receded enough to expose muddy patches where the grass used to meet the edge. It was working. I didn't tell anyone what I'd done. I just watched. The HOA started sending out messages to residents a few days later, claiming that unusual environmental factors were causing a temporary drop in water levels. Greg even posted on the community page about hiring an environmental consultant to look into it. I nearly laughed out loud when I read that. He had no idea the environmental factor lived right in his own neighborhood. Each passing day, the water line sank lower, and I could see the resort's floating dock beginning to tilt awkwardly as the supports hit mud. Guests complained online about the unsightly appearance of the shrinking lake. Property owners started to panic, worried about their home values. Meanwhile, I just sat on my porch with my morning coffee, looking at what used to be my bridge and the now exposed earth where the water had been. It was poetic in a way. The lake was giving back what it had taken, and I was the quiet hand behind it. I didn't do it for money or for revenge in the dramatic sense. I did it because sometimes people in power only understand loss when they feel it themselves. The HOA took something beautiful from me without hesitation, and now they were learning that beauty can disappear just as easily. I wasn't finished yet, but as I watched the sunlight glint off the drying mud at the edge of their $1 million resort, I knew one thing for certain: they had started a war they could never win. The morning the lake finally disappeared, the sky was the clearest it had been in months. I woke up before sunrise, not because I planned to, but because some part of me knew something big was about to happen. The air outside was cold, the kind of sharp chill that bites at your skin but makes you feel alive. I poured myself a cup of coffee, stepped out onto the porch, and looked toward the lake. What used to be a shimmering expanse of blue had turned into a dull, muddy basin stretching across the land. The reflection that once painted the sky had vanished, replaced by cracked soil and the skeletons of old tree stumps that had been hidden beneath the water for years. It was a strange sight, haunting and quiet. The birds that used to hover near the water line were gone, replaced by the sound of the wind cutting through dry reeds. At first, I thought maybe I'd feel guilty. I thought maybe watching it like this, knowing I'd been the one who made it happen, would bring a pit to my stomach or a tremor of regret. But instead, what I felt was something entirely different. Calm. The kind of peace that comes not from revenge, but from balance being restored. The HOA had taken something from me, something personal, something meaningful, and now they were standing on the edge of losing something they had never respected. Justice, in its rawest form, doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it's as silent as an empty lake at dawn. The chaos started around mid-morning. I could hear it before I saw it, the sound of voices echoing across the open air, panic rising like smoke. I walked down to the edge of what used to be the water line and saw a group of people gathered near the resort dock, or what remained of it. The once floating platform now sat tilted on cracked mud, the pontoons jutting out at odd angles. A few maintenance workers were out there, waving their arms, pointing toward the center where the last pools of water still glimmered weakly. The resort manager was shouting into his phone, his shoes sinking into the sludge. The perfect image of their luxury escape had turned into something out of a drought documentary. By noon, the HOA board members had gathered near the community center, their golf carts lined up like a makeshift crisis command post. Greg, of course, was in the middle of it all, red-faced and barking orders at anyone who would listen. I stood far enough away not to draw attention but close enough to hear bits of their conversation. Words like disaster, liability, and insurance claim flew around. Apparently, the resort was already fielding cancellation calls from angry guests, and homeowners were panicking about the plummeting property values. Someone mentioned the estimated loss already exceeding $4 million in damages and devaluation combined. That number hung in the air like a ghost. $4 million gone, just like that, all because they couldn't leave one man's bridge alone. I kept my face straight when people passed by. Everyone had their own theories: drought, underground leak, faulty engineering, but no one dared to say sabotage. It was easier for them to blame nature than to imagine someone had done this on purpose. The irony, of course, was that nature itself was finally reclaiming what humans had stolen. The dam had simply returned the land to what it had been before they built their artificial paradise. That afternoon, Greg went door to door, handing out notices about an emergency HOA meeting. He stopped by my house, clipboard in hand, trying to play the part of a concerned leader. His smile looked forced, sweat glistening on his forehead. "We're dealing with a major environmental issue," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "We think there may be a blockage somewhere in the dam system. You haven't noticed anything unusual near your property, have you?" I met his eyes and let a long silence fill the air before answering. "No," I said, steady and quiet. "Haven't seen a thing." He nodded, scribbled something on his clipboard, and walked away without another word. As he left, I caught sight of the lake bed again over his shoulder, the cracked earth stretching farther than ever. It looked like the land itself was smiling. By evening, the news trucks had started arriving. The resort was a local attraction, and the sight of an entire lake vanishing overnight was too strange to ignore. Reporters set up cameras, their voices echoing across the empty basin as they speculated about environmental mismanagement and possible infrastructure failure. I stood at the edge of my property watching it all unfold like a movie. There was something oddly beautiful about it: the reflection of red and blue lights flashing off the dry ground, the confused expressions of people who spent their lives thinking they were untouchable. The next day, engineers came out to inspect the dam. I made sure to be nearby, pretending to be just another curious resident. They examined the rusted gates, the control box, the spillway, all the things I had touched. They found the crank slightly open but assumed it had rusted loose with age. One of them even said, "This thing's been here longer than the HOA itself." Surprised it lasted this long. I almost laughed. They didn't even realize the truth was standing right beside them. For the next few weeks, the chaos didn't die down, it spread. Homeowners began threatening to sue the HOA for negligence. The resort suspended operations indefinitely. Local realtors panicked as property prices dropped nearly overnight. The board members who once strutted through the neighborhood with clipboards now avoided public spaces entirely. The once bustling community events were cancelled, and the pristine walking trails now led to nothing but a vast, empty crater. Everything that had made the place desirable had vanished. I went down to the dam every evening just to listen. The trickle of water had turned into a steady hum as the last pools of the lake drained away into the stream below. Nature was reclaiming what was hers, bit by bit. Grass began sprouting where water once lapped. Birds nested in the reeds again, and small animals started returning to the newly exposed land. It was a strange, beautiful transformation, the rebirth of something authentic from the ashes of greed and vanity. One evening, about a month later, I saw Greg again. He was standing near the old dock, staring out over what used to be the lake. His once confident posture had wilted. I walked past him without saying a word, but as I did, he turned and muttered something under his breath. I caught only a few words: "This ruined everything." I didn't stop walking, but a quiet satisfaction bloomed in my chest. Maybe now he understood what it felt like to have something meaningful destroyed. Eventually, the HOA held another meeting, this time about long-term water restoration plans. They talked about fundraising, government aid, and permits to rebuild the dam system. But I knew none of it would matter. The cost alone would bankrupt them, and without the lake, the allure of their so-called resort community was gone. What they had built on shallow principles had literally evaporated. By winter, the ground where the lake once lay had hardened into open meadowland. The reeds had grown tall, and deer often wandered through at dusk. I rebuilt my bridge not over water this time, but over a small creek that trickled through what used to be the lake's center. It wasn't as grand as before, but it was mine again, untouched and free from anyone's permission. Sometimes I stand there and look out over the land, remembering how it used to look and how it ended up this way. The Hoa destroyed something that belonged to me because they thought power made them untouchable. But in the end, power belongs to those who understand balance. They learn the hard way that when you take from someone without respect, nature and sometimes fate finds a way to take it all back. And as I stand on my new bridge, watching the wind ripple through tall grass instead of water, I don't feel guilt or pride. I just feel peace.